glad to be with you today. I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave in little more than 10 minutes because I have another conference in Paris that I need to give. But let me try to be very quick. So the title of this talk is From Social Democracy to Democratic Socialism, Lessons from a Brief History of Equality. So basically, most of what I'm going to say today comes from this book, A Brief History of Equality, which I strongly recommend to your attention if you've not read it yet. This is a much shorter book than my previous books, Capital in the 21st Century and Capital and Ideology, which were, 1,000 page long. This one is 200 page long. So, this can be read in a few hours or a few days. And I think actually it's a better book and a clearer book than the previous one. So, don't hesitate to have a look. Some of what I'm going to tell you today also comes from this World Inequality Report 2022, which we have published at the World Inequality Lab in Paris and which you can find online very easy. So in this talk, I'm going to try to make two parts about, coming from this title, From Social Democracy to Democratic Socialism. First part is going to be about the very successful rise of one might want to call social democratic capitalism, in particular through the rise of the welfare state and progressive income taxation in the West during the 20th century. And the second part is going to be about, what comes next and what kind of transition from social democracy to what I call participatory socialism or democratic socialism. And I will argue that the next step is to go much further in terms of permanent circulation of power, property, and opportunities, in particular via progressive wealth taxation and redistribution, more workers' rights, and educational fairness. And, the kind of perspective I am proposing here is really a perspective for the long run. So, I'm not saying this is going to happen next week or next year or next decade. But, I think the transformation of capitalism that we've seen, say, between the sort of colonial, patriarchal, authoritarian, very unequal kind of capitalism that we had in 1910 to the kind of social democratic capitalism that we've had, say, since the 1980s, is already an enormous transformation, and the kind of transformation I imagine for the future, and maybe by 2050 or maybe by 2080, in the long run, it's a similar kind of transformation. If you don't like the term democratic socialism and you prefer to talk about social democracy for the 21st century, I have absolutely no problem with this, as long as we agree about the content. So let me start with some basic evidence about this movement toward more equality that we've seen in the past, which I think has been very successful. So here I give you an example from France, where we have particularly good historical data on inequality, starting with the French Revolution, but we have similar data to some extent for Sweden, for Britain, for a number of European countries, and to a lesser extent, we've also seen this movement toward more income equality in the United States. So here you can see, the distribution of income that is broken down into three simple groups, and you can see that there's a strong long-run evolution toward more equality of income. Now, in terms of equality of wealth, which is the same, the next figure, you can see that, there's also a movement toward more equality, in the sense in particular that the share of total wealth going to the top 10% has declined in the long run, to the benefit of what I call here the patrimonial middle class, which is a sort of middle 40% group that is in between the top 10 and the bottom 50. So there has been more equality of wealth also in the long run. And I think this has been also a source of increased economic prosperity, because this has allowed the middle class to invest more in homes, in firms, and to create more opportunity and more upward mobility. But this movement toward more wealth equality has been more limited than the movement toward more income equality. And in particular, you can see that the bottom 50%, has never been very high. And again, that's for France, but it's very representative of what we see in a number of other Western European countries, and to some extent in the US. Although in the US, since the 1980s, the rebound of inequality has been stronger than in Europe. But we still have a level of wealth concentration that is less today than what it was a century ago in the US. In particular, the middle class today has a bigger share of wealth, although it has been declining in the US since the 1980s, which is probably not so good. But so to summarize, in the long run, there's a movement toward more equality, both in terms of income and in terms of wealth. But in terms of wealth, it is really a more limited movement, and we still have quite extreme level of wealth concentration. This is true, so here, throughout Europe. So you can see that until World War I, we have pretty extreme concentration of wealth throughout Europe, and at the time it was more concentrated in Europe than in the US. You can see here France, Britain, Sweden, which was incredibly unequal at the time, with a very unequal political system until World War I. Throughout the 20th century, you can see that here I compare Europe 1913, Europe 2020, that we have moved toward more equal distribution of wealth, but we still have hyper-concentrated wealth distribution. The United States today is a little bit in between Europe today and Europe in 1913. It's still more equal than a century ago, but it's extremely concentrated. In particular, the bottom 50% owns very little. I should say, we get this same kind of picture if we look at within age group distribution. So it's not just an age effect, it's also true within the young, within the old. So this is a much, very structural feature of wealth concentration. We see this throughout the world. So here you have, this comes from the World Inequality Report 2022. So you can see, in Europe, it's a bit more equal, in the sense that the top 10% owns only 58% of total wealth, and the bottom 50% owns about 4% or something like this. But it's still very concentrated. So in Latin America, it's only 1% for the bottom 50% and 77% for the top 10. So that's even more unequal. But by and large, it's very concentrated pretty much everywhere. So is this something that can be improved in the future? Well, before getting to this question, let me come back through time and how we have collectively made progress in terms of more equality in income and to a lesser extent in wealth in the past. I think one of the most the most important factors is what I call here the rise of the social state, particularly in Europe. It's you have the same evolution, but in a smaller way, with a smaller welfare state in the United States or in Japan. So you can see, before World War I, total tax revenue were less than 10% of national income, and it was mostly basically law and order, army, police, etc. But very little social spending, very little educational investment. So the education is, and together with health and other human capital investment, is a typical example of a social spending which, in the long run, has brought more equality together with more prosperity. So if you take education, until World War I, total educational spending in all European countries is less than 0.5% of national income, with very elitist educational system at the time. The US has actually an important educational advance at the time. It's about 1% of national income in educational spending, which is still quite small, but twice as big as in Europe. And until the middle of the 20th century, there's a strong US educational advance, which is probably the main explanation for the productivity gap between the US and Europe and the rest of the world for most of the 20th century. Now, over the long run, total educational spending has been multiplied by more than 10 as a fraction of national income, from, in Europe, less than 0.5% of national income before World War I, 6% today. But what you can see also on this graph is a stabilization and actually a stagnation of total educational investment since the 1980s, 1990s, which is also something you see in the US, which is very paradoxical because, of course, the fraction of a generation going to higher education has continued to increase a lot. So if you have the same spending as a fraction of national income, it means that you invest actually less per student over time. And, I think if we want to explain the slowdown of productivity growth, this is really the number one explanation, in my view, depending on how you write your growth model and your equation for productivity growth, you can easily see how a stagnation of educational investment can generate productivity growth slowdown. And, I think, more investment in higher education and, increasing total public spending, which requires also more fiscal fairness, is certainly one of the most important policies for the future. I was referring to fiscal fairness because, I think one of the reasons why the expansion of the social state was possible in the long run was the development of progressive taxation. So here, you can see the evolution of top income tax rate. You can see how the United States in particular invented a very steeply progressive taxation over the course of the 20th century. I think this was pretty important because of course, everybody has to pay for the welfare state. But if you want the middle class to agree to contribute to the welfare state, you need to ensure that people at the very top, are paying more than what the middle class is paying. And this is what tax progressivity over the course of the 20th century did, and this is not the case anymore. And I think it was the demolition of progressive taxation starting in the 1980s was, I think, an historical mistake, and I think it's high time to revisit the experience with high tax progressivity. So many people get very nervous when we talk about a top income tax rate of 80-90%, like the one we had in the US and in Britain during a large part of the 20th century. I think, in particular, in the case of the US, it was a big success. If you look at the evolution of productivity growth, so here on the left axis you have annual growth rate of per capita national income in the US, and on the right in red you have the top income tax rate. You can see that, in the 1980s, the discourse by Ronald Reagan was to say, okay, we are going to cut top marginal income tax rate. Maybe inequality is going to increase, but growth is going to be so much higher. There's going to be so much innovation than, the wages of average Americans are going to grow like you've never seen. And we are going to see maybe more inequality, but with a bigger pie, everybody is going to benefit from this. Now, the problem is that what we've seen is actually a division by two of the growth rate. Now, I'm not saying the division by two of the growth rate is due to the division by two of the top marginal income tax rate. I think the explanation, as I was saying before, is more the stagnation of educational investment. But at the very least, what we should all agree from this is that dividing by two the top marginal income tax rate in itself is not really bringing more innovation, more productivity growth. And in fact, the basic explanation and my reading of the enormous body of historical evidence on inequalities that we've been putting together at the World Inequality Lab is that you certainly don't want complete equality. Maybe for incentive reason you want an income scale of 1 to 5, 1 to 10. You can, some people will say 1 to 20. I think 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 is actually sufficient. But in any case, 1 to 100, 1 to 200, I think the evidence, historical evidence, is that this doesn't bring anything substantial in terms of productivity growth, and that there's this very high tax progressivity was actually quite a good idea. So now, what about the future? Well, if we want to keep moving in the direction of equality, I will argue that in terms of wealth concentration, we need something like a redistribution of inheritance. So here I just give an example where you would finance through a progressive tax on wealth and inheritance, a minimum inheritance equal to 60% of average wealth, which would be about 120,000 euros for an average wealth of 200,000 euros in France today, but you can do the computation for other countries. Now, as compared to the discussion, the previous presentation, and the proposal by Ackerman on minimum capital, I should make clear that this comes on the top of the social security system, of the entire social welfare system, on the top of the basic income scheme that we already have in many European countries, actually in most Western European countries. So that's really in addition to this, I think the basic income, say around 50 or 60 or 70% of full-time minimum wage is very important, but it's not sufficient. And I think having minimum wealth and a meaningful minimum wealth for the bottom 50% is very important, because this is what will bring additional bargaining power for the bottom 50%. So, wealth is more than just money. It's also when you own zero, you need to accept any job you are being offered. You have very little bargaining power. When you own, even 100,000 euros, 200,000 euros, this may seem very small from the point of view of a billionaire. That's almost like zero. But in fact, it makes a big difference, because you can buy a home for your family. You can start up a small business. You have a better bargaining power vis-a-vis your own life and vis-a-vis the rest of society. I also discuss, how to generalize and extend the kind of co-determination system with more workers' rights in the board of companies, which has been in place in Germany or Sweden for a number of decades, and I think it's possible to go much beyond. And the third important ingredient behind democratic socialism is more educational fairness. So, everybody pretends to be in favor of equal opportunity and equal access to education, but in practice, this is what we see. If you compare the percentile of parental income with the rate of access to higher education in the US, so this is work by Raschetti and Emmanuel Saez, you can see, you are very close to the 45-degree line. If your parents are very poor, you have only a 25% chance to go to university. If your parents are very rich, you have a 95% chance. And of course, in fact, it's even worse than that, because you don't go to the same university when your parents are very rich. So the question is, are we happy with this? Is this the best we can do? Or do we want to set targets to improve this? You see enormous inequality in education, also, in other countries, not only in the US, also in France. In historical perspective, and let me stop there, there's actually been some progress. You see enormous inequality in educational investment in societies of the past. So here I take a very extreme example of a colonial society, which is Algeria under a French colonial rule around 1950. I compare with France 1910, which was a very unequal country. I look at France 2020 today, which looks very equal as compared to these two other societies, but in fact, the children in the bottom 50% are 5 times more numerous than the children in the top 10. So in fact, they get an average educational spending, which is twice as small as, or in fact, almost 3 times as small as children in the top 10%. So this corresponds, in fact, to a very elitist educational system that we have in France right now. So, the conclusion is that the historical movement toward more equality and prosperity, which has been very successful in the past, is not over. And in particular, social democracy is not a finished product. The view that, we have achieved sort of perfect social democratic institution in the 1980s, 1990s, and that we should stop there, I think is an illusion. Thanks a lot for your attention, and sorry that I'm going to have to run right away because of another commitment in Paris, and I'm already 5 minutes late and I really have to run. Sorry about this.